everybody. My name is Aggie Kotzé. As Jack pointed out, I'm the REACH Consortium Manager for the Lead REACH Consortium, which is managed by the International Lead Association. We represent approximately 100 companies that are either manufacturers or importers of lead and lead compounds, about 26 lead compounds. I'm also the co-chair for the Authorisation Restriction Platform at Eurometto, and France is my co-chair, and it's very unfortunate that she can't be here today because she was actually the key person in putting this presentation together on behalf of industry. And I think it will flow nicely with a lot of the topics that have been discussed in the last 2 days. I won't go through the contents, but I think the most important thing here is I'll be discussing the main key learning lessons from industry on the authorization application process and what recommendations we can actually get from this process. So this presentation is obviously on behalf of a number of sectors. Eurometto, who represent the non-ferrous metal sector, who represents a number of commodities, metal commodities, including companies, and CEFIC, as you all know, representing the chemicals industry, as well as AMCAM, who represent obviously the American companies in Europe. So what are the main aims of this presentation? Well, first of all, to share their experience from an industry point of view on authorization applications and provide some recommendations, as well as review the overall authorization process. And the main key areas that I'll be talking about today is on the preparation of the authorization application, also the pre-submission information session, as well as the RAC and SEEC assessment, the trialogues, as well as the broad information for users. So what are the key questions that we would like to ask ourselves when preparing an authorization application? So first of all, do you actually need to apply? Second of all, who to involve and who will actually apply for the authorization application? How to define a use, how much time do you actually need, and what kind of information is actually needed. And I think this last one is very critical to all of us, really. So first of all, do you need to apply? Well, you have to ask yourself the question, do you have any potential cases for exemptions? Do you think you have any arguments, good potential arguments with backing that you have an intermediate argument, perhaps an Article 58.2 argument, or maybe one of the generic exemption arguments? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, the outcome of the risk management option analysis is really key. So what is the proposal from an industry point of view? Well, first of all, we feel that it's very critical that a risk management option analysis should be performed. And first of all, we think there should be some consistency between legislations, such as parallel overlapping legislations that should be considered when carrying out a risk management option analysis. There should be some harmonization at European level, and what we actually mean by that is if one member state is performing a risk management option analysis, should there be a level playing field when somebody else submits a risk management option analysis from another member state? Early consideration of a risk management option analysis, and this could be prior to a substance being identified as a substance of very high concern, because you already know if it fulfills the classification criteria, or even before the candidate listing. And then also start any retroactive risk management option analysis for substances that are actually listed on the candidate list. On the exemption side of things, clarify up front the use to be exempted. You need to really make this very clear. You have to have very supportive evidence and justifications as to why you think you have potential case for exemptions. Consider deselection from the candidate list. I think this one is a bit controversial because we all know that you can't actually remove substances from the candidate list. But if there's a possibility that a substance has been added to the candidate list, is there potential for a substance for which a risk management option analysis was performed that it could be exempt? Then the eco opinion, to ensure better harmony and reduce uncertainty. How to define the use? Well, first of all, we all know registration was very, very different than authorization, and the needs are very different under both regimes under REACH. So the use under the registration dossier can be very different from the authorization regime. Supply chain communication, I think this is really key to any authorization. You really, really need to identify all the stakeholders in the supply chain, and that's really critical, and it's very, very difficult in some cases. It really depends on how complex the supply chain is. So the proposal is, try and keep it simple. Translate your use descriptors into a simple wording describing the use process. Secondly, review the use based on the analysis of alternatives. Contact the entire supply chain, and I'll tell you this is not an easy task in identifying all the key stakeholders in the process, especially if you have a complex supply chain and you're representing a number of uses and a number of substances. This can be really tricky. So the sooner you do this, the better. Who to involve? Well, as I said, many supply chains are complex, others aren't. There's many stakeholders in the process. It can be anything from producers, importers, distributors, to downstream users, and even your super downstream users, which we've been hearing the word a lot these days. Users not using the substance are very high concern as such, but depending on what the outcome will be of an authorization application, they might not really know what the consequences are, and those people are actually not always easy to find. So what is the proposal? Yes, key. Identification of the key players up front, the need to contact all these actors, early communication during the risk management option analysis. And I'll tell you, this is very, very important, and the sooner you do this, it's very, very helpful. Who will apply? Well, this is really dependent on the complexity of your supply chain. Whether it's less complex or a lot more complex is really, really dependent. One also needs to consider when you're applying for an authorization is who can actually apply. Because we all know if a downstream user would like to apply on behalf of somebody, they can only go one level up. So you have to really consider and map out all the users in the supply chain to see whether you will be okay and you've covered all the relevant people. So yes, it's key. Identify the submitters. In the chromates case, for example, they identified that maybe the formulators should actually apply for the authorization. And, in some cases, can a downstream user actually apply for an authorization? Will they be covered enough? It really depends on how your supply chain looks. So in some cases, for some complex cases, you might need 2 applications rather than 1. Allow downstream users to cover several steps. I think that's one of the key areas that we would like to look at, considering there would be a lot more leverage into how we can do the applications. By when do you need to apply? Well, we all know about the latest application date, and it has been made clear that the latest application date is very relevant, obviously, to ECHA's workload because of some of the substance that are going through can be a lot of hard work. And also, from the chromates case, we've seen that ECHA has been looking into the latest application date for various users for certain substances, which is very positive. The latest application date, as well as the sunset date, needs to be pretty realistic for industry. And that is relevant, once again, to the complexity of the supply chain. One positive thing that I would like to say is, yes, we would like to have the freedom to have the latest application date and sunset date to be adapted to the complexity of the sector. And one opportunity for that is during the second public consultation, where we can actually submit comments as to why we feel, as an industry, why we should have a latest application date than the one recommended. So at the end of the day, we would like to have a latest application date that not only suits the regulators' needs, but also industry's needs. And what's important for us is that there's consistency between legislations and harmonization at European level. So how much time do you actually need for an authorization? Well, It all depends, first of all, on the complexity of the supply chain. It's very dependent. We've heard a lot of cases, single cases, where one company might be able to apply much quicker than somebody that's applying in a much more complicated supply chain. Supply chain awareness. Do you know who all the different actors are in the supply chain, which is critical? And who's going to be doing what? When are they going to do it? And how are they going to do it? That is very critical. Data sharing, we've heard that. It's a big issue. Some folks, for example, the downstream users, they might not have access to the chemical safety report. How easy is that to access? Then there's other data sharing issues. What parts of the application would you like to share together and what parts not? So those sort of decisions need to be looked at. But I think the main key point here is that you need to start as soon as possible. It's a complicated process, and the more complex your supply chain, the more complicated it gets. So the sooner you get started, the better. And that's prior to the candidate listing, I would say. Ensure that publicly available data are shared on a legal basis. Okay, which kind of information is needed? Well, we all know we need hazard data, we need exposure data, we need a socioeconomic analysis, an analysis of alternatives, and so forth. And there are guidance documents available. But what we've heard from many of the cases from industry, even though many of them have been successful and with various review periods, I think there's still some unclarity from industry as to what is exactly needed. So we thought, as an industry, perhaps it would be worthwhile to have a checklist focusing on the most critical data that is required and how to gather them. And then secondly, if we could perhaps get access on an anonymous basis, obviously, for some cases that we could look at. Obviously, each case is an individual case and unique in its own right, but I think it's good to learn from best practices. And considering there's been a number of cases that have gone through very well, I think that would be in our benefit. So what do you actually do after the authorisation application submission? Well, first of all, communication with authorities is important. The RUC and SEAC assessment, and then you look at the quality of the authorisation application. Now, first of all, I think from many of the presentations, it seems like the pre-submission information session is very beneficial and that most people should use this time to actually submit as much as possible, as it's been very useful. The trialogue, we've heard that most of the times the rapporteurs will only contact folks from substances where they actually have additional questions. But from the session of yesterday, it seemed like some folks would have actually wanted to have a trialogue and they didn't, just to provide some clarity on these substances and maybe that would be useful. And then lack of exchanges during the committee assessment. So we would like to see an increase in transparency. The authorisation application is obviously a one-shot chance. So if you get it wrong, you get it wrong and very badly. So it's very important to ensure that the input from applicants is very critical from this process. On the chemical safety report side of things, I think what's come out from industry that there are some unclarities how to manage and actually meet the RUC expectations. I think we don't always know exactly what the expectations are during these applications. And then also the level of scrutiny of the non-threshold substances. There are a number of non-threshold substances that have gone through, but I think there is a lot of questions about the level of scrutiny when you actually go through the RUC process, for example, or the SEAC process. So the proposal is to provide a fit-for-purpose template based on the RUC requirements. Maybe it will provide industry a little more clarity. On the exposure assessment, we've heard during yesterday's session that, yes, measured data, monitoring data takes preference over modelling data. But there is a question mark because there are companies, there are sectors that have used modelling data. Might not be in the process of authorisation, but I think what's important for industry to know is when modelling can actually be used. What level of scrutiny can be expected on the exposure cases of non-threshold substances? So this is a proposal, and we don't need an answer today, but maybe something that RUC can think about, and we invite it to maybe provide clarifications for us on that point. On the socioeconomic analysis side of things, what level of detail is required? And I think we've heard from a number of cases, some of the cases were maybe one company involved, and we heard of cases where folks put together an authorization application, 7 days, 30 days, a couple of months. But I guess the more complicated the supply chain gets, maybe you need a more thorough SEA. But what level of detail do we actually need? And I think that's a big question for industry, because we're not always certain as to what level of detail is required. It's very important, yes, that the SEA is linked to the analysis of alternatives. And we've heard that if we have an SEA that's too complex, it doesn't work either. So we should also avoid generic statements without strong data support, which is very important, I think, because if you are making claims that you're going to lose your market and you'll have to relocate outside of Europe, you have to somehow justify that. So proposal, keep it simple, focused, and credible to ensure a good understanding by non-industry experts. On the adequate control route or not, I think this has been brought up a couple of times, and a number of the substances that actually applied for an adequate control route, it seems like they got this through, but there was one case that we heard of that didn't necessarily get the adequate control route. I think there's a risk that this route is not accepted by REC, which we've seen with a case. There could also be disagreements with the DNLs, because as we know, ICA is trying to produce reference DNLs and dose response curves, and these reference DNLs have been used for substances that have actually been going through authorization applications, which is positive. So the proposal is, yes, develop reference DNLs on time. I think that's from our point of view from industry, that we can actually do the work, we can actually have enough time to actually complete the application. So we need a plan B, really. The review period. Based on the applicant's request, mainly focused on availability of alternatives, we've heard if you don't submit an authorization application with good quality data, you're not going to get a very good review period. But we've heard of very good cases where folks have been given 12 years. So the proposal is, can we actually look at exposure of the substances? So for example, if there's a substance where there's minimal exposure or no exposure, can we perhaps ask that industry gets a longer review period? And then perhaps much longer review periods for uses, for example, in the recycling sector or spare parts. So suggestions on how we can actually improve the application for authorization process. So first of all, good communication is key. We all know this. The more complicated your supply chain is, the more important it is. You have to establish those very good relationships with your downstream users, whether they're your downstream super users. It really depends on where you are in the supply chain. Yes, and there should be a link between the substance of very high concern and the final product at the end of the day. A simple application, avoid disproportionate application, focusing on direct socioeconomic impact, realistic analysis of alternatives and well-defined uses, stay focused, and the application must obviously be fit for purpose. So what else does streamlining mean? Well, for the applications that are full applications, we could potentially maybe recommend that better tools could be developed to help us with the process. For example, for the sections that may not be relevant, for example, or not applicable to the applicant. Maybe we can have standard boxes developed for that. For the simplified application, according to the specific use targeted, we thought of maybe the applicants could submit figures, schemes, or perhaps a table to explain the entire exposure assessment. And the authorities could perhaps consider a better review period for these substances, considering these substances could be, there could be limited exposure or perhaps no exposure of these substances. I think industry feels that if a longer review period was provided for these sort of substances, that this would actually stimulate companies to want to invest in these sort of substances. The focus on the socioeconomic analysis, we think it could be simplified, and only on the use and non-use scenario if there aren't any alternatives. Then the extraordinary simplified application in specific cases, and this is really specific cases where we're talking about low volumes or spare parts or maybe recycling. Sorry. And then we said we potentially could develop and clarify a model argument template, and that could be for potentially closed system, highly regulated environments, bridging application that we've heard of. We've heard of a number of these stories, and we think there could be simplified authorizations for a number of these cases that were discussed in the first session, which flows in nicely. We also heard about the multilingual application that the Commission gave a presentation on yesterday, that this is also a good idea. We need statements for specific uses such as low volumes, spare parts, and end product subject to approval scheme, and partly exempted uses, example, recycling. So I think the most important thing is to continue business that is our interest, industry's business, and to be compliant in Europe, and to minimize any uncertainty on the market, to see that this application is granted if you're applying for an authorization. And the needs, consistency, we would like to see a consistency between legislations. Clarity on managing and understanding committee expectations, and clarity on a level of details required. And my last slide. The conclusions. I think it's very important to note that, yes, industry and authorities have a common interest, and we would like to make this system work. And it's good, and I think it's very important for us to work together as industry regulators in order to make this authorization application work. And streamlining is obviously important to make sure that we have some consistency between industries and regulators' needs. And I think it's key that we are all proactive in the process. And lastly, I think authorization application is a part of the overall risk management system, which needs to be effective, transparent, and efficient.
Thank you.